This is the brief on portable wealth and local taxation. Okay, so the big idea? The days when wealth was stuck in one place. Those are over. Capital's super mobile now, And it's this powerful force governments just can't strong arm anymore. So how is this shift really changing the tax game? Well, there are three key things going on. First, money just feels different. It used to be heavy, locked in factories, letting governments slap on huge tax rates. But now, deregulation, fiber optics, money's like vapor, zips across borders instantly, almost impossible to trap. Second, local governments gotta be careful. Crank up the heat with tough taxes or rent control, they risk an exit. We're talking the productive folks, maybe dual-income families making good money, funding schools. They see high taxes as opt-out. They'll just move NYC to the burbs, DC folks over the river, they don't stick around to fight. And finally, taxation isn't coercion now, it's courtship. Since wealth can walk, cities have to woo capital. They compete with tax breaks, new infrastructure, think Amazon's HQ2. Sometimes it's urban alchemy. Big projects like stadiums become excuses to revitalize, attract prestige, and boost the tax base. So yeah, the contest for money? It's gravitational. Governments need to realize they orbit wealth, because that productive class loyalty,
looking at this
it's
piece,
totally
it's
portable.
not the 19th century anymore. Really interesting take on how wealth mobility is changing the game for cities and their biggest taxpayers.
Yeah, it paints a clear picture. This idea that wealth isn't tied down anymore, it's like vapor.
Exactly, vapor. It just dissolves geography, right? Show companies, digital transfers.
Gives the wealthy and capital itself huge leverage over cities.
So the framing is this shift from, cities telling taxpayers what to do to cities having to sort of court them.
That's the core of it. It's a fascinating setup. Let's dive right in and see how we can maybe push that argument even further, make it even more robust.
Sounds good. Where do we start?
Well, the first big thought I had was this. The essay really nails the diagnosis, the limits of taxing mobile wealth, but it could probably be stronger on the what next, the policy pivot for cities.
Right. It makes a strong case that cities kind of have to blink first. They can't afford to lose what the writer calls the invisible scaffolding.
Uh-huh. Those $300,000, $400,000 households?
Yeah, exactly. And it shows how those old 80–90% tax rates only worked when capital was physically stuck. Factories, paperwork.
But those days are gone. So we get why income taxes are failing.
Okay, so the weakness then?
The weakness, I think, is that it describes that cycle really well. Punitive tax, people leave, city offers concessions, but it kind of stops there.
It diagnoses but doesn't fully prescribe.
Exactly. It leaves you wondering, okay, if high taxes don't work, what are the levers left for a city that now has to attract or at least keep this mobile wealth?
So the suggestion is to shift the focus away from just showing what fails.
Yeah, shift from what doesn't work, the high taxes, the moral lectures, the peace mentions, towards a really pragmatic look at what modern leverage points cities still have, things that wealth can't just easily exit.
Okay, leverage points that are harder to escape. Like what? Give me some concrete examples.
Well, the writer could explore things like specific, localized services, or maybe regulatory things that capital can't just bypass.
You mean stuff tied to the physical place?
Precisely. Think about geographically inescapable fees, maybe congestion charges, or environmental fees tied directly to a physical building, or, localized consumption.
Print sometimes, doesn't it? It has to land somewhere to be used.
But couldn't that just push, say, big corporate HQs just outside the zone where those fees apply? Are we just moving the goalposts?
It's a risk, sure, but maybe frame it as taxing friction. The physical stuff, the offices, the apartments, the infrastructure they need that's still grounded.
Okay.
So, an alternative could be looking at local control over essentials, things like, utilities, or maybe that last mile of fiber optic cable.
Ah, the actual pipes and wires.
Exactly. You might not be able to tax the CEO's income if they hop between states, but you can charge a premium for the super high-speed connection their trading desk needs in their downtown office.
So it reframes the city not just as a tax authority, but as a service provider for essential, non-movable infrastructure.
Precisely. It becomes a client-provider relationship for certain things. That seems like a practical angle to explore more.
That's a really solid suggestion. Turns unavoidable local presence into a potential revenue source. Okay, that makes sense for the first point. What's the second area?
The second area is about really nailing down that idea of vapor.
Okay.
The essay does a great job with the residential flight, the frogs, as it calls them, jumping out of the pot.
Right, the people moving from California to Austin or wherever. It's vivid.
It is vivid, but the argument about wealth being vapor could be even stronger if it more tightly linked that physical movement with the non-geographic movement of corporate capital, abstract capital.
Yeah, the piece mentions it, money flowing through shells, trusts, subsidiaries, businesses incorporating in Delaware while the shop is on Main Street.
Got it. So the weakness is...
The weakness is that the story relies maybe a bit too heavily on the physical moves. Saver into Singapore, the DC commuters. It's relatable, but it slightly undersells the core idea that for the biggest pools of wealth, geography is kind of already dissolved thanks to digital transfers and deregulation.
So it feels like two separate issues almost. People moving and profits moving, but not fully woven together?
Exactly. It leaves the argument a little siloed. You have the visible problem of the frogs leaving the pot, and the invisible problem of the corporate value just hollowing out.
Okay, so the suggestion is to bridge those two more explicitly.
Yes. Show how cities are getting hit on both fronts simultaneously. They're losing the income tax from the residents who leave, and they're being undermined by the invisible routing of corporate profits, the vapor.
Making it clear it's a pincer movement, basically.
Right. It maximizes the threat level, justifies that strong title. It's not just a few unhappy rich folks leaving. It's a systemic drain.
So, concretely, how could the piece do that? Especially that hollowing out part.
Well, it could detail more how a city ends up, chasing shadows. Like, they can tax the local coffee shop easily.
Sure.
But the holding company that owns it, that routes billions through some low-tax jurisdiction, much harder. And then maybe bring in the newest layer of this.
Which is?
Remote work. Post-2020 remote work. It's like a third wave of portability, right? And it challenges that old idea that, say, high-end professional services needed a prestigious physical address.
Ah, the idea that you had to be physically in London or New York for reputation.
Exactly. That was maybe the last tether for some of these higher earners. But now, a top lawyer or consultant can potentially work from anywhere, a low-tax state, without losing that New York lawyer credibility.
And that directly hits the city's ability to claim residency-based income tax, because the work itself is becoming detached from the physical city.
Precisely. The labor becomes vapor, too, in a way. Detached from that expensive office tower, that needs to be woven in tightly to show the full scope of the challenge.
Okay, that really clarified the scale. Excellent. So what's the third main point?
The third one is about the core philosophy in the conclusion.
Okay.
The essay's real strength is its pragmatic, almost physics-based view of capital, right? Money follows the path of least resistance, like water or gravity.
Yeah, I liked that framing. The rich aren't villains, they're thermometers, reacting to the environment. No protests, no slogans, just arithmetic. That's a powerful line.
It is powerful, and we want to keep that sharp edge. But the potential weakness is that the conclusion leans quite heavily into the psychology of it all.
How so?
It talks a lot about wooing taxpayers, avoiding contempt, the negative effects of rhetoric like killing billionaires, suggesting that if cities are just, nicer, capital might stay.
And that risks making it sound like it's just about manners or political tone?
Exactly. It could slightly dilute that core deterministic claim that at the end of the day, arithmetic always wins. It might sound more like a plea for better PR than a hard-nosed analysis of cost-benefit.
Which undermines the whole financial gravity argument that makes the piece so strong. It suggests if the mayor just smiles more, the problem's solved.
Right. And is there a risk there? Does focusing on the emotional legitimacy angle maybe overlook the fact that, high net worth people will just move when the math changes, no matter how politely the city asks them to stay?
So the suggestion isn't to ignore the taxpayer reaction, but to frame it differently?
Precisely. Reframe the psychological bit to actually reinforce the supremacy of financial physics.
How would that work in practice?
Present the taxpayer's decision less as a reaction to, moral outrage or feeling unloved, and more as a purely logical, risk-managed response.
Like portfolio management for where you live?
Exactly. They're just responding to a deteriorating ROI on residency. It's not about hurt feelings, it's about capital's extreme sensitivity to friction. The wooing only matters if the numbers are already close to making sense.
So concrete examples, focus less on the rhetoric and more on the triggers?
Yes. Focus less on the moral lectures that, raise the temperature, and more on the specific, concrete policy actions that instantly change the math.
Like a sudden change in property tax assessment?
Perfect example. Or a new state fee that wasn't well communicated and hits high-value assets hard. That stuff immediately shifts the arithmetic.
And causes the exit, regardless of whether the mayor sent a nice letter.
Right. It reinforces that idea of the princess and the pea class. They're exquisitely sensitive to financial friction, not just harsh words. Keep the argument cold, calculating, physics-based, right to the very end.
Okay, that feels like a much tighter way to land the conclusion, consistent with the core thesis. This has been really helpful.
Good.
So, just to recap, the 3 big opportunities we discussed. First, broadening the policy analysis beyond just income tax, looking at those inescapable location-based friction points.
Right. Taxing friction through things like infrastructure access or usage fees.
Second, really integrating the vapor of abstract capital and remote work with the story of physical residential flight, showing the combined threat.
Uh-huh. Connecting the invisible hollowing out with the visible exodus.
And third, recalibrating the conclusion to keep the focus firmly on the cold arithmetic, the financial physics, rather than letting it drift too much into psychological appeals or political tone.
Exactly. Frame taxpayer sensitivity as a logical ROI calculation, triggered by concrete policy changes, not just rhetoric.
The actionable takeaways seem clear then. Analyze that non-tax leverage, detail the full scope of portability, including corporate structures and remote work, and keep the final argument grounded in that pragmatic, ROI-driven reality.
Sounds like a plan. The piece is already strong, very insightful.
Absolutely. It's got a powerful voice and a fresh angle. These suggestions are really just about maximizing this completeness and ensuring the policy implications are as robust as the diagnosis.
Agreed.
We definitely invite the writer to consider these points, refine the piece, and of course, feel free to submit it back again.
Today, we're really getting into something fundamental. The nature of modern wealth, how it moves, why it moves, and maybe most importantly, its incredible ability to just vanish when it feels, well, unwelcome. We're calling this one the portable power of wealth. And, sometimes the best starting point is almost the most unlikely one. Our source material actually kicks off with this anecdote from, believe it or not, a social media comment section. Someone challenged the writer, basically saying, name one time rich people actually moved just to avoid taxes.
Ah, yes, that old chestnut. It pops up all the time, doesn't it? This fundamental disbelief that wealth, especially the big generational or corporate kind, can actually pack its bags and leave. People see buildings, they see factories, and they think, okay, the money's stuck here.
They equate the physical stuff with the financial reality, fiscal immobility, as you put it.
Exactly. But the sources just immediately knock that down. The moment you ask the question, the examples just, well, they flood in. It's not even hard to find them.
Right. Like example number 1, pretty famous one, Eduardo Saverin, the Facebook co-founder.
The classic modern case, really. He renounced his U.S. citizenship, moved to Singapore. And the timing. Just before Facebook's massive IPO, we're talking about a move that likely saved him, well, potentially billions in taxes. That wasn't, about the weather in Singapore.
No, that was a spreadsheet decision, pure and simple, made by someone at the absolute top of the tech game.
And he's just the tip of the iceberg, really. You don't even need to look globally. Just look inside the U.S. right now. The shifts are enormous.
You mean the California Exodus narrative, that kind of thing?
Well, it's more than a narrative, isn't it? It's happening. You see this steady stream, sometimes a flood, of high net worth folks, entrepreneurs, entire companies moving out of high-tax places like California. And where do they go?
Austin and Miami seem to be the big winners, or at least the most talked about.
They are. Austin is maybe the cliche now, but it's grounded in reality. And Miami, it's fundamentally changed. It's become this huge financial center, largely fueled by that migration from the Northeast and California. And these aren't just people buying winter condos. It's permanent relocation. It's human capital voting with its feet.
And then you get the really dramatic international examples, like the French actor Gerard Depardieu. our sources brought him up. That was quite the performance.
Oh, absolutely. When France hiked its top tax rate significantly, he didn't just, complain to his friends. He made a huge public spectacle of it.
He moved to Belgium first, right? Lower taxes there.
Yes, and then, almost like a calculated insult to Paris, he took up Russian citizenship. And he specifically, publicly, cited Russia's low flat tax rate as the reason. It was a signal flare. He was basically saying, look, if you make taxes feel punitive, we have options. We can leave. And he made sure everyone knew it.
So the common idea that wealth is tied down anchored. It's just not the reality anymore. It's incredibly fluid, maybe even hypermobile.
That's the core premise we have to accept to even start this conversation.
Okay, so our mission today in this deep dive isn't really to debate if the rich move. That seems pretty clear. It's more about the how and the what. How did capital get so portable? And what does this freedom, this physical mobility actually mean for cities, for taxes, for how governments even function?
Exactly. Understanding that shift in the, let's call it the physics of capital, is crucial because it leads directly to this paradox the source points out. When a city tries to push its upper class financially, they don't really fight back in the traditional sense. They don't organize protests or lobby heavily.
They just leave.
They just leave. Quietly, efficiently, they move. And that completely changes the power dynamic between the governed and the government.
There was that interesting example from New York City recently, the election of Zohran Mamdani. He ran on a pretty ambitious progressive platform, right? Things like universal rent freezes, big public housing pushes.
Very ambitious. And policies like that, they obviously require significant funding, which means, inevitably, higher taxes on the wealthier residents and corporations.
And the reaction wasn't just political debate in the city council. It was faster than that, more immediate.
It bypassed politics almost entirely. The anxiety hit the private market instantly. The sources highlighted these immediate, tangible signs. You saw headlines suddenly screaming about bidding wars for houses up in Westchester County. Listings in wealthy parts of Connecticut, like Greenwich, suddenly getting tons of interest.
And realtors in New Jersey apparently had their phones ringing off the hook.
Right. It's like a collective, almost subconscious flight response kicking in. It shows that the decision isn't about abstract loyalty to the city. It's a gut reaction to a perceived threat to their financial comfort zone.
A kind of fiscal thermometer, as you said. The needle spikes and people start looking for the exits even before a policy is actually enacted.
Precisely. The planning starts, the calls are made, the Zillow searches happen the moment the rhetoric heats up. It tells you the calculation is pragmatic, not ideological.
Okay, that really sets the stage. Let's dig into how we got to this point. Section 2. The physics of capital. From heavy metal to vapor. Because to really get why today's wealth is so mobile, we need to understand why yesterday's wasn't.
Absolutely. You have to go back to what the sources call the era of heavy money. Think roughly 1940s through the 1970s. It seems almost unbelievable now, but back then, the U.S., Western Europe, they can sustain incredibly high top marginal tax rates.
Yeah, numbers that sound crazy today. 70%, 80%, even over 90% in the U.S. at the peak. How is that even possible? Why didn't everyone just leave then?
Well, the short answer is they couldn't. Not easily anyway. The sources make it clear the physics were different. Money was, in a very real sense, physically trapped. It was bound by layers of legal and infrastructural friction that just don't exist anymore.
What kind of friction? What held it down?
Well, first, think about where wealth came from. Mostly physical assets. Owning a steel mill, controlling port infrastructure, running a big factory complex, that stuff was bolted to the ground.
Right. A Rockefeller couldn't just decide on a whim to move Standard Oil's refineries to, say, Panama, could they? The cost and complexity would have been astronomical.
Exactly. The physical anchor was immense. But it wasn't just the physical stuff. The whole global financial system was designed to prevent easy movement of capital.
Ah, the legal framework.
Yes, the Bretton Woods system specifically. After World War II, the goal was stability. That meant regulated exchange rates and, critically, strict controls on capital flows between countries. Moving serious money internationally wasn't just a matter of clicking a button.
It was a bureaucratic nightmare, I imagine.
A huge one. Layers of paperwork, government approvals, currency controls, significant transaction costs. That source image of the French banker in 1955, needing a cargo ship to physically move a large amount of francs offshore. That perfectly captures the sheer weight, the immobility of capital back then.
A whole cargo ship. It's hard to even picture now. So that was the world of heavy money. Fixed, anchored. But then, as the sources say, the shackles snapped. Money became vapor. What broke the chains?
It was really a confluence of factors hitting around the same time, starting in the late 70s and really accelerating in the 80s and 90s. You can break it down into maybe three big things: deregulation, technology, and logistics.
Okay, let's take deregulation first. That sounds like it removed the legal barriers.
Pretty much. There was this global wave of financial deregulation. Countries wanted to attract international finance, so they started dismantling those Bretton Woods-era capital controls. They opened up their capital accounts. Think about things like the repeal of Glass-Steagall in the U.S., similar moves in the U.K. and elsewhere. Suddenly, the legal permission to move money freely was there. The paperwork hurdles started vanishing.
And then technology provided the means, the speed.
Exactly. Fiber optic cables spreading everywhere. Computers getting exponentially more powerful. Financial transactions went from taking days or weeks, involving physical transfers, to being instantaneous. Digital. Wealth wasn't gold bars in a vault anymore. It was electrons. Numbers on a screen.
And those numbers could be moved anywhere in the world before breakfast, as the source puts it.
Literally, the cost of moving vast sums dropped from, well, the cost of chartering a ship to practically zero. The physical friction just evaporated.
Okay, so deregulation opened the door, tech provided the speed. What about logistics? You mentioned container ships. How did they play a role? They move goods, not money directly.
But they enabled something crucial: the hyper-optimization of global supply chains. Yes, container ships made moving physical goods incredibly cheap and efficient. But that efficiency allowed multinational corporations to structure their operations in incredibly complex ways, specifically designed to minimize taxes. Well, you could manufacture components in country A, high tax maybe, ship them via container to country B, low tax, for some minor assembly or just processing, and then book the final sale and the bulk of the profit in country C, a zero tax haven. You could legally shift where the profit was recognized by carefully managing where ownership transferred, often while the goods were literally still on the ship.
So the container ship facilitated tax avoidance strategies, essentially, by making the physical movement of goods so fluid and cheap.
Precisely. It allowed the financial engineering to align perfectly with the optimized physical logistics.
Okay, so you put it all together. Deregulation, instant digital transfers, hyper-efficient global logistics. The anchor is well and truly gone. And the sources argue this just completely flips the power dynamic between governments and capital.
Completely reverses it. The leverage shifts almost entirely to the owners of capital. And that observation in the source material is so sharp. Whenever a politician gets up and makes that promise, we're going to make the rich pay their fair share, you could almost predict what happens next.
It turns into a game of chicken. The government threatens higher taxes or more regulation.
And capital threatens to leave. And the government, the city, the state, they almost always blink first.
Why? Why do they blink?
Because the potential consequences of capital flight are catastrophic for their budgets. We're not talking about thousands and thousands of people needing to leave. Sometimes it's just a few hundred key taxpayers, or one or two major corporations deciding to relocate their headquarters. The fiscal hole that opens up is immediate, it's huge, and you can't just fill it by taxing the remaining population more. They might leave too, or they simply don't have enough income.
Especially if it's that crucial upper middle class, that $300K, $400 professional bracket we mentioned, if they get nervous.
Their departure cripples the funding for schools, for transit, for everything. The city faces an immediate budget crisis.
So the government blinks, and what happens then? Do things just go back to normal?
Rarely. What usually follows is the charm offensive. Instead of demanding more, the city starts offering concessions. You see new tax credits rolled out, maybe special enterprise zones created, billions offered for things like Amazon's HQ2. They actively try to lure the wealth back, or keep it from leaving in the first place.
The source had that great image trying to coax the frogs back into the pot.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. Often, when the wealth does come back or decides to stay, it's on better terms than before. They've successfully used the threat of leaving to negotiate a sweeter deal, lower taxes, less friction. They get rewarded for their mobility.
Which just reinforces the power dynamic even further in their favor. It's a cycle where the government keeps giving away leverage.
It is, which leads us nicely into looking more closely at who these really crucial mobile frogs are. Section 3, the thermometer class. Who moves and why? Because it's easy to just picture billionaires on yachts. But the source says the real pressure point, day to day, isn't necessarily them.
Right. It's not just the Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk figures, although they matter. It's a broader group.
It's what the source calls the dual income professionals. Think senior managers, successful lawyers, doctors, consultants, tech workers, the people pulling in, say, $300,000, $400,000, maybe $500,000 a year.
The upper middle class, maybe upper class, depending on your definition, but not the mega rich.
Exactly. These folks are the bedrock of a blue state city's budget. Not through splashy philanthropy, but through the steady, boring churn of payroll taxes, state and city income taxes, and, crucially, massive property taxes on expensive homes. They might not own the company, but their combined tax payments fund the subway, the good public schools, the parks, the police.
They're the invisible scaffolding, as the source puts it.
That's a perfect description. And when this group gets restless, the city's finances don't just wobble, they genuinely risk collapse. And the scary part for cities like, say, New York or San Francisco or Chicago is how easily this group can inflict that pain.
They don't need to pull up stakes and move all the way to Florida or Texas necessarily.
Not at all. They just need to cross a state line. Move from Manhattan to Jersey City, from D.C. to Arlington, Virginia, from Boston to southern New Hampshire. It's a short commute back into the city for work or fun, but their income tax, their property tax, that now goes to the other jurisdiction.
They still use the city's infrastructure, the roads, the museums, the job market, but the city loses their direct tax revenue.
Precisely. The city bears the cost, the suburbs or neighboring state gets the revenue. It's the geographical arbitrage of the tax base.
And the Washington, D.C. example in the sources really drives this home, doesn't it? It seems like the ultimate case study.
It's a stark warning. D.C. is the economic heart. The federal government, the contractors, the lobbyists, the law firms, the high-paying jobs are there. The culture, the restaurants, the amenities are in D.C. But where do a huge chunk of the high earners actually live?
Maryland and Virginia. The sources say something like 2/3 of the D.C. workforce commutes in.
An incredible number, 2/3, including a very large proportion of those crucial high-income professionals. And here's the key structural problem for D.C. It lacks a commuter tax. It cannot tax the income earned within its borders by people who live just across the river in Virginia or Maryland.
So D.C. pays to maintain the metro system that brings them in, pays for the roads they drive on, the police that keep downtown safe, the museums they visit on weekends.
But the income taxes flow to Richmond and Annapolis, and the hefty property taxes on those expensive suburban homes flow to Fairfax County or Montgomery County. D.C. is essentially subsidizing its own tax base erosion. It pays the costs of being the regional hub, but a huge chunk of the benefit, the tax revenue, leaks out across the border.
The source calls it a clear vision of the future for any city that doesn't grasp the mobility of its tax base.
It really is. And the motivation for that move, that decision to live in Arlington instead of Adams Morgan, the sources emphasize it's usually not about some deep ideological commitment to Virginia over D.C. It's simpler.
It's arithmetic, as they put it.
Yes. The author shared that personal memory of New York in the 70s, during the fiscal crisis. The adults weren't debating the nuances of city policy or crime waves when they talked about leaving. They were doing the math. What's the tax bill here versus there? What's the cost of housing?
Just a straightforward cost-benefit analysis.
Exactly. Like the person quoted living in Arlington admits they have a good deal now, but says flat out, if the math changed, they'd be gone. Not if the politics offended them, but if the numbers on their personal balance sheet no longer added up.
Which explains that fantastic phrase the source uses to describe this sensitivity, the princess in the pea class.
Isn't that brilliant? It captures it perfectly. They are so attuned to their financial comfort, their fiscal environment, that they feel the slightest disruption. A politician just floats a new millionaire's tax, there's serious talk about rent control expansion, a whiff of a wealth tax proposal.
And they don't wait to see if it passes.
No way. That initial feeling of comfort curdles into unease, maybe even feeling targeted or resented, and boom, they're already making calls looking at properties in the cooler pan next door. It's preemptive. They leap before the policy even gets debated seriously.
Because they can. They have the resources and the mobility to simply opt out of the fight.
And it's not just their money that's mobile. We also have to talk about the portability of reputation. There's another huge shift. Historically, professionals like doctors or lawyers were tied to a place because they had to build a local reputation, a local practice over years, right?
Yeah, your network, your clients were all geographically based.
But that anchor is largely gone too. The source makes that great point. A top lawyer with New York or London on their CV, that credential travels better than their luggage.
That's good.
It is. Because that accumulated human capital, the prestige, the skills, the perceived quality it migrates with them, intact. They can land in Miami or Austin or Denver and immediately be seen as a premium import, skipping years of building local credibility from scratch.
Geography just loses its grip. Licenses can often be transferred between states relatively easily now. Clients can be served over Zoom.
The physical location of the fancy office matters less and less. The value resides in the individual's digital footprint, their reputation, their portable skill set.
And this hollowing out, this separation of value from place, even affects businesses that seem really grounded, like a local shop.
It does. And it shows how tricky it is for cities to actually tax the wealth generated within their borders. Take that neighborhood coffee shop or boutique. It pays property tax on its physical space, sure, but the owners, they're likely incorporated in Delaware for legal protection and maybe favorable corporate law. They might bank with a national or international bank based elsewhere.
And the profits?
The profits can be structured to flow through holding companies or related entities located in low tax or no tax jurisdictions. The city sees the physical storefront, it can tax that, but the actual income, the liquid wealth generated by the business, that can be legally flowing somewhere else entirely.
So the municipality is left trying to tax the container, but the valuable contents have already been routed elsewhere.
That's a great way to put it. They're chasing shadows. They can hike property taxes, hitting the physical asset, but the real engine of profit and capital accumulation might be operating under a completely different tax regime, miles away. It's a constant battle against global financial optimization.
Which brings us right to the core of the relationship change. Section 4, the psychology of taxation, courtship, not coercion. If money is vapor, if reputation is portable, then the old ways of just demanding taxes don't work anymore.
The whole model is flipped on its head. Historically, government power rested on coercion, backed by the fact that wealth couldn't easily flee. Now, it's all about courtship. Aggressive, sometimes desperate courtship. Cities are basically running nonstop beauty contests to attract and retain mobile capital and high earners.
And the Amazon HQ2 saga was the ultimate example of this, wasn't it?
Oh, it laid the whole dynamic bare for everyone to see. Arlington, Virginia won in the end. But did they win because they had the best schools or the nicest parks? No.
They won because they offered the biggest dowry, as the source calls it.
Exactly. Massive tax breaks, promises of bespoke infrastructure improvements tailored just for Amazon, favorable zoning changes, essentially handing over public resources to lure a private company.
And dozens of other cities were doing the same thing, falling over themselves to offer Amazon sweetheart deals.
They were throwing themselves at Bezos's feet, competing to give away the most public money. Why? Because they believed the prestige of landing Amazon and the secondary effects, all those high-paid workers moving in, the new businesses popping up to serve them, the eventual rise in property values would eventually pay back the initial cost of the dowry.
It's an investment, sure, but one made from a position of weakness, right? The city is essentially begging the corporation to choose them.
Absolutely. It reveals who really holds the cards. Which brings us back to that frog in the pan analogy. If a city wants to fund itself through its high earners, it needs very careful temperature control.
You have to warm the water slowly.
Exactly. Modest tax increases, maybe, fees that feel reasonable, lots of emphasis on civic pride, quality of life, making the wealthy feel appreciated, valued, keep the water comfortably warm.
But if the political rhetoric changes, if there are sudden, sharp tax hikes proposed, or if the language becomes adversarial, soak the rich, eat the rich.
The temperature spikes.
Yeah?
And the frogs leap. Not just across the river this time, maybe. They leap to genuinely cooler ponds. Florida, Texas, Nevada, maybe even overseas to Dubai or Singapore. The options are global now. If the local environment feels hostile, they're gone.
This really highlights what the sources call the erosion of civic religion, that older idea of a mutual obligation between wealth and the city.
Yeah, back in the 20th century, there was this ingrained sense, almost a moral expectation, that great fortunes were tied to the place they were made. Wealth had a responsibility to give back. Think of the names Carnegie, Rockefeller, Ford on libraries, universities, museums.
They were taxed heavily, but also sort of revered as patrons. Their philanthropy was part of the deal, the noblesse oblige.
Right. They bought public esteem, in a way, by writing huge checks for public benefit. But the source argues that today, the moral framing is often inverted. Wealth itself is increasingly portrayed as suspect, maybe inherently unfair or even criminal.
So when politicians use rhetoric about killing billionaires or constantly framing the wealthy as the enemy,
They might get applause, sure, but they also achieve two things simultaneously. They push the tax base out the door, and they drive the private donations. Why would a foundation or a wealthy family write a big check to the local symphony or hospital if they feel actively despised by the city's leadership and a chunk of its population?
You can't legislate gratitude.
You really can't. And that's the core psychological insight. Taxation, especially at high levels, relies on a degree of voluntary compliance and emotional legitimacy. If that legitimacy erodes, if the donors feel alienated or attacked, the private checks stop coming, and the public tax revenue shrinks too because the base is leaving. It's a double whammy.
The city ends up trying to run on fumes and resentment, which leads to how cities physically change themselves to try and keep that legitimacy, or at least keep the money around. Section 5. Urban alchemy. The fig leaf of revitalization.
Yeah, the whole gravity is reversed. Cities now orbit wealth, not the other way around. The winning cities aren't necessarily the ones with the most progressive social policies. They're the ones with the best amenities, the least friction, and the quickest commute to an airport. It's a service industry model now.
Which explains why city governments seem obsessed with landing big prestige projects, the Olympics, a new NFL stadium, a giant convention center expansion.
These aren't just about civic pride, though that's the selling point. They function as coded invitations to mobile wealth and corporations. They signal, look, we're investing, we're clean, we're modern, we're safe. Please choose us. Please build your next office tower here.
They're chasing the secondary benefits, the gentrification effect, but they can't actually say that's the goal.
Absolutely not. You can't run for mayor on a platform of let's displace the poor to make room for luxury condos, but you can run on revitalization or economic development or world-class infrastructure.
So public works projects, stadiums, highways, waterfront redevelopments become the respectable excuse. The fig leaf, as the source calls it.
Exactly. They provide the political cover to do what's necessary to attract the desired demographic. Building a new freeway through an old neighborhood, or putting a gleaming arena in a formerly blighted area. It's a polite way of signaling to the princess and the pea class. We're clearing out the undesirables and creating the polished, frictionless environment you prefer.
And again, the D.C. examples are really powerful here. Nationals Park, the baseball stadium. That area used to be pretty rough, right?
Navy Yard. Yeah, it was post-industrial, vacant lots, high crime rates. When the stadium deal went through, using significant public funds, it was widely slammed as a massive billionaire subsidy for the team owners.
But look at the area now.
Completely transformed in just a decade or so. Michelin star restaurants, luxury apartments everywhere, high-end hotels, big corporate HQs like defense contractors moving in. The stadium acted as the catalyst, the publicly funded anchor that drew in waves of private, high-value investment.
And the Verizon Center, now Capital One Arena, did something similar for the Chinatown area downtown.
Same playbook. Use a big, shiny public-private project to inject energy and attract investment into an area that was struggling. The source even had that little anecdote about the 9.30 Club.
Oh yeah, the music venue. In the 80s, easy parking because the neighborhood was sketchy.
Right. No one else dared go there late at night, according to the source. Now, it's surrounded by upscale development, tech offices, trendy restaurants. The revitalization followed the path cleared by these big projects.
So the cycle is, use public money for a prestige project that draws private investment, which leads to gentrification, which ultimately raises the property values and the tax base. Urban alchemy.
That's the formula. And it creates this paradox for city leaders.
Yeah.
They desperately need the increased tax revenue and polished image that gentrification brings to stay fiscally solvent in this mobile world. But to get it, they often have to facilitate displacement using revitalization as the justification. The playbook works, fiscally speaking, so it keeps getting repeated. Call it infrastructure, and you can bulldoze the past.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 6, portable loyalty and the end of the anchor. We've seen how the money moves, why it moves, and how cities try to adapt. What's the final takeaway? What's the new hierarchy?
Well, the hierarchy is completely upside down compared to 50 or 60 years ago. Governments don't just tax the rich anymore. They basically audition for them. States don't hold inherent power over capital. They're leasing it, always subject to capital deciding to move elsewhere.
The source says the moment a city really threatens its key contributors, it panics.
Instantly. It behaves exactly like a city trying to keep its sports team from leaving. The team owner threatens to move. The city scrambles to offer a new stadium funded by taxpayers. Wealthy residents or a major employer threatens to leave or actually starts leaving. The city scrambles to offer new tax breaks, regulatory relief, other goodies.
Capital has become the ultimate constituency, the one you can't afford to alienate.
Because it's the only one with a credible exit threat that can cripple the entire budget overnight. Its mobility gives it effective veto power.
But what about just love of place? You know, people who are deeply connected to their city, their neighborhood. The source calls them the saints of the urban church. They won't leave no matter what, right?
They exist, absolutely. The true believers, the ones who say, this is my home, I'll fight for it, even when taxes go up or services decline, they treat their neighborhood like sacred ground. And the source acknowledges them, respects them.
But they're the exception.
They are the exception.
Yeah.
Most people, especially those in that crucial mobile professional class, operate more pragmatically. They might love their city, but they won't martyr themselves financially for it if a significantly better deal is available just across the river or a short flight away. They'll find the cooler pan rather than chaining themselves to the hot one out of pure nostalgia.
So for city leaders, that distinction is critical. Affection is nice, but it doesn't pay the bills. Love of place isn't revenue.
It's nostalgia. It's emotion. It's no longer a reliable anchor in the way it might have been when leaving was genuinely difficult or impossible. That deep tie to geography that allowed for high taxes and assumed loyalty, it's been severed by mobility.
We're in an era of portable money, portable reputation, and portable loyalty.
That's the crux of it. The city is now essentially a service provider competing for customers who can leave at any moment.
Which leads to that final, really stark thought from the source material.
Yeah, it's quite provocative. The simple knowledge that the pan has handles, that exit is always an option for those with means, changes everything. It reframes the whole discussion about civic duty, taxation, belonging. Who truly belongs to a place anymore, in the sense of being inescapably tied to it?
The source concludes it's only those too proud or too poor to leave.
Everyone else is potentially transient, their loyalty conditional on the math and the amenities. It suggests that the real power, the liquid wealth that used to be the engine of the city, has already, in a functional sense, departed. It exists in the cloud, globally mobile, choosing where to alight based on the best offer. The city is left managing the physical infrastructure for whoever remains.
Wow. That is a pretty sobering takeaway. Leaves you with a lot to think about regarding the future of cities and states in this environment.
Welcome
It certainly
to the debate.
does. The game
Today,
is fundamentally
our discussion centers on this really fundamental shift, the changing relationship between government and capital. Specifically, we're looking at how the mobility of wealth, how easily it can move, impacts a city's power to tax and fund public services.
Right. And the core question we're digging into, based on the material, is essentially this. Has the fact that wealth is so portable now fundamentally stripped modern governments of their, let's say, coercive taxing power? Are they now forced into a constant courtship dance with their highest earners?
Exactly. And I'll be arguing that yes, absolutely. Capital is now the dominant force. The old days of high, compulsory taxation are basically over. When wealth and government play that game of fiscal chicken, wealth just wins. Every time.
Okay, and I'll take the counterposition. While I definitely acknowledge the huge impact of capital mobility, you can't ignore it. I'll argue that cities still have some pretty powerful tools. They're effective, yes, but indirect. Think strategic urban planning, controlling amenities, building that intellectual prestige. Modern governments isn't powerless. It's just changed its tactics. It's less about demanding tribute, more about earning allegiance, perhaps.
See, I view that less as an evolution and more as a collapse of government leverage. You can trace it pretty easily, almost like physics. Money, it used to be heavy. Think about the 1940s through the 70s. The U.S. could impose, these incredibly high marginal tax rates, close to 90% sometimes, because capital was geographically stuck. You had physical factories, docks, headquarters, huge amounts of paperwork defining them. You couldn't just pick up U.S. steel and move it to Bermuda overnight.
Sure, the physical anchor was stronger then.
Right. And that whole framework, it just vanished. Financial deregulation, fiber optics, instantaneous digital transfers. Money basically became vapor. And crucially, this isn't just about the billionaires, the Eduardo Severins renouncing citizenship. It hits hardest with what I call the invisible scaffolding of these high-tax blue state budgets. That's the $300,000 to $500,000 dual-income professional crowd. Their state income taxes, that's what's funding the bulk of public care.
Mm-hmm.
So when state or city policies start to, let's say, challenge the comfort level of this group,
like some of those proposals discussed in New York City. Remember after Zohran Mamdani's election? Things like big hikes in high-end marginal rates, wealth taxes. Their reaction is immediate. It's precise. It's surgical. They don't, go out and protest. They just do the arithmetic. They opt out. They move across a river, across a state line. You see these sudden spikes in Greenwich condo listings, panicked calls to realtors in North Jersey. It happens fast. And what's the result? The city, inevitably, has to concede. They end up offering tax holidays, these innovation corridors, trying to coax that revenue stream back. The evidence is pretty clear. The government blinks first.
Okay, I approach this from a slightly different perspective. I absolutely agree that governments can't coerce capital like they used to. But saying they're therefore powerless, I think that misunderstands the kind of power they now wield, often quite skillfully. The state isn't a jailer of capital anymore. It's more like a sophisticated impresario, maybe. Modern revenue generation, I think it's best understood as a very effective courtship. Cities lock in their tax base by being the main producer of two really high-value assets, prestige and amenities.
You mentioned the physical limits of moving Standard Oil back in the day. But today's capital, it's often intellectual capital, social capital, so cities have shifted. They're not just demanding taxes on immovable stuff anymore. They're hosting this massive, ongoing beauty contest for movable investment. We saw this play out perfectly with the whole Amazon HQ2 competition, didn't we? Arlington, Virginia, they didn't just capitulate, they invested strategically. They offered this sort of dowry, you could call it, of infrastructure perks, tax breaks. That wasn't weakness. That was a calculated economic move designed to secure a critical mass of high-earning professionals and, importantly, anchor them physically.
A dowry paid by the public, though.
Well, yes, but with an expected return. And furthermore, cities engage in what I sometimes call urban alchemy. This involves these huge public works projects, building arenas, convention centers, redeveloping waterfronts. On the surface, it's about progress and culture, but it also serves as a politically respectable way to, frankly, displace blight and accelerate gentrification. And that is indirect revenue capture. By jacking up property values and attracting a higher income bracket to a revitalized area, they boost the property tax base exponentially. And they do it without needing those headline-grabbing high marginal income tax rates that, as you said, can trigger that flight response.
I have to push back on that. Framing the Amazon HQ2 saga as a demonstration of state power seems backward. To me, it showed state weakness. They were forced to pay, essentially bribe, for something they once could have simply demanded through regulation or taxation. And while we talk about corporations, I want to bring it back to the psychological fragility of that productive class I mentioned earlier, the Princess and the Pea class.
Okay.
Taxation, fundamentally, relies on voluntary compliance. It needs a certain, maybe fragile, sense of civic emotional legitimacy. All this rhetoric about eat the rich, sure, it's politically energizing for some segments, but fiscally, it can be catastrophic. It just raises the psychological temperature for higher earners. It turns their comfort into, palpable contempt sometimes. And once a productive professional or a major philanthropist feels genuinely despised by the governing class or the prevailing mood, the checks stop, both the tax checks and the voluntary philanthropic ones. We saw this, didn't we, with those specific NYC tax proposals. They weren't just tinkering with income tax brackets. They were floating some pretty radical wealth transfer ideas. And the immediate result, it wasn't a nuanced policy debate. It was a mass exodus of financial planning. People started making calls. And when those private checks dry up, the ones funding university centers, hospital wings, local arts foundations, the public safety net, which actually relies quite a bit on private goodwill to fill the gaps, it frays almost instantly. This is a crucial miscalculation, a temperature mistake that governments seem to make repeatedly.
I'm sorry, but I think that framing reduces very complex urban fiscal management down to sort of the wounded feelings of wealthy individuals. While I agree civic attachment has certainly weakened, it's far from gone. The source material itself mentions true believers, people who genuinely treat their neighborhood like sacred ground. But even putting idealism aside, cities still fundamentally control the structural factors that make capital want to cluster in the first place.
Like what, specifically?
Well, the state's power now really lies in manipulating what you could call the gradient of comfort. You brought up Brooklyn earlier. Think about it. Early 90s, what high-earning finance professional wanted to live in Brooklyn? Very few. Now, it's a global symbol of aspirational luxury, and it carries a massive tax base. The actual geology didn't change. What changed was the government's investment strategy focusing on infrastructure, safety, schools, cultural amenities. Cities control the quick commute to the international airport, the quality of the top-tier restaurants, access to unique cultural institutions people want. Wealth chases desirability. That is a strategic, structural lever the city can and does pull, essentially compelling the mobile professional to stay where the physical ecosystem sustains their lifestyle and, crucially, their career.
I'm just not convinced that amenity control truly overrides the sheer logistical ease of the exit strategy. The math, it's merciless, particularly in these border regions, which I think really demonstrate the failure of that structural leverage argument. Let's look closely at the DC example you brought up indirectly. It's staggering. Something like 2/3 of the entire metro workforce lives outside the city limits, in Maryland or Virginia. DC has tried for decades to get a commuter tax implemented, but it keeps getting blocked politically, often by Congress itself, leaving this huge gaping hole in their revenue.
Right, that's a specific political blockage, though.
It is, but look at the result. DC ends up subsidizing the infrastructure, the transit, the police, the public spaces for professionals who earn their money in DC but pay their crucial income taxes somewhere else. That high-earning lawyer or lobbyist, they only have to cross the Potomac River, maybe move 5 miles, to save tens of thousands of dollars a year in taxes. That calculation is immediate. It's powerful, and the physics of the situation, as I see it, mean the city is left chasing shadows. It can tax the storefront, sure, but it can't easily capture the corporate profits routed through a Delaware holding company, or the income earned by someone whose legal residence is in McLean, Virginia.
Okay, but the DC scenario you describe, that's arguably a failure of legislative coordination and maybe political will between jurisdictions, not necessarily proof that capital itself is ungovernable. If Maryland and Virginia rely heavily on DC's economic engine, well, logically, they should cooperate on revenue sharing or find a way to implement that commuter tax to ensure the whole region remains viable.
Should, but don't.
Fair enough. But I want to hone in on your point about the lawyer or the consultant just needing to cross the river. While the money certainly moves easily, does the professional leverage move quite so easily? I'm not so sure. Even these highly mobile professions, they rely heavily on reputation, right? And that reputation, that valuable asset, it's often generated and significantly magnified, specifically within these Tier 1 global cities. Think about it. A lawyer with Wall Street on their resume, or a consultant with K Street experience. That carries a certain undeniable prestige that travels with them. But the actual value of that credential, it's still tied to the continued vibrancy, the high-density functionality of the city that granted it. If everyone just up and left New York for tax reasons, eventually New York's professional reputation itself would atrophy, wouldn't it? The desire for that physical, high-productivity networking environment, the theaters, the high-end culture, the face-to-face deals, that still has to be supplied locally. The city controls the supply of that prestige, those amenities. And in doing so, it forces wealth to effectively pay a lease, you could say, even if it manages to avoid a direct tax bill. The physical metropolis itself acts as this indispensable, high-end finishing school for global capital.
It's an interesting point, but we have to circle back to the fundamental challenge that necessitates all these tax policies in the first place: funding the social safety net. I agree, we run a kind of shadow socialism in America. ERs generally treat everyone who walks in. There are robust food banks. Actual starvation is minimal compared to history. But maintaining even that basic system depends utterly on consistent revenue and, crucially, the sustained goodwill of the productive class. When government attempts high-level coercion, or even rhetoric that feels like coercion, it doesn't just risk losing some income tax revenue. It risks destabilizing the whole system.
Look at some of those proposed New York State tax increases. Independent fiscal analyses predicted they could trigger such an exodus of professionals earning over $1 million that the state would suffer a net loss of revenue, not the intended gain. It's a fiscal boomerang effect. It proves you just cannot legislate gratitude, you can't tax resentment without facing serious consequences. The moment giving feels forced rather than like voluntary participation in a shared civic enterprise, the foundation starts to crumble. So, we're forced to fund public care with our eyes wide open, knowing that if we push that leverage too hard, the tax base we rely on could just evaporate.
I see the policy challenge, definitely. But I would frame the act of that aggressive, amenity-driven courtship, the stadium deals you dislike, the infrastructure perks, I'd frame that as the necessary, almost structural cost of maintaining that funding stream in this new world of highly mobile capital. You might call it weakness. I'd lean towards calling it an adapted strategy.
A costly adaptation.
Perhaps. But consider the city's paradox. It absolutely needs a stable tax base to meet its social obligations. But often, the most reliable way left to secure the increased revenue needed is through revitalization projects that require substantial private investment. And yes, this often involves the displacement and gentrification achieved via these massive public works, frequently masked as progress or cultural enhancement. Think about the history of the Nationals Park deal in D.C. Yes, it was heavily criticized at the time as corporate welfare. But within a decade, that same area was filled with luxury high-rises, major defense contractors, high-end retail, multiplying the property tax base many times over. This gentrification, however politically sensitive it might be, seems to be the most reliable, if indirect, mechanism cities have left to secure the higher property and payroll taxes they need to stabilize that safety net. The city is applying indirect coercion, maybe, aimed at geographical improvement, which in turn attracts the revenue, rather than applying punitive taxation aimed directly at the individual's balance sheet.
I still have to challenge the idea that this alchemy, as you call it, is truly sustainable or even morally neutral in the long run. It often requires the city to effectively sell off pieces of its geography to private interests at a deep discount, offering long-term tax abatements like TIF districts that significantly undermine future tax capacity just to secure current residency. So the central tension for me remains exactly where we started. We are trying to apply a 20th century model of public finance, one that fundamentally relied on capital having mass, having roots, having loyalty, to a 21st century reality where money and professional loyalty right along with it are almost entirely portable. Governments today, like it or not, are forced into this permanent orbit around wealth. And any tax policy, no matter how well-intentioned or socially necessary it might seem, if it mistakes wealth for an immovable, captive asset, well, it's just fiscally and politically doomed from the start. The exodus isn't driven by passionate protest, it's triggered by cold, hard arithmetic.
The power dynamic has undeniably flipped. I grant you that. Cities are forced to audition now, not demand tribute. However, the successful outcomes of this urban alchemy we've discussed, like those significant lasting increases in the tax base around major public amenity investments, they prove, I think, that cities can still generate an almost irresistible gravitational force. They still control key variables that the wealthy and the capital they manage are compelled to chase: concentrated professional opportunity, world-class quality of life.
So it's about tone then?
In large part, yes. The decision for a city becomes less about whether to tax or not tax and more about maintaining that welcoming, attractive tone and continuously delivering the tangible benefits that justify the admittedly high price of admission. The truly successful city in this new era is the one that masters the art of crafting an irresistible lease agreement, you might say.
But the fact remains, the capital and the highly skilled professionals who manage it, they know they're sitting in that proverbial pan of water, and they all know perfectly well they can hop out the moment the temperature rises too high.
And that self-awareness, that knowledge that the competition is always active, it's constant, that has fundamentally altered the relationship between government and the governed. It confirms the game is far from over, certainly, but the rules, they have been forever changed.